Yeah, just hit the 100 mark.
Yeah.
Why don't we get started then? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to the Hyperledger Pune meetup. Actually, what is the first of a series of meetups and conversations we're having here, organized by the Hyperledger Pune meetup community. In particular, I want to thank Kamlesh Nagwar, who has been very instrumental in coordinating these conversations. Personally, I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm Executive Director of Hyperledger, and I am very I'm very rueful, very sorry that I can't travel there in person to Pune to participate in this conversation. I've been to Pune a couple of times in the last 20 years, speaking to what is actually a tremendous, not only technology community there in Pune, but also a really significant open source community and free software community. So we know that there's this tremendous amount of interest in not only what the Linux Foundation does, which is what Hyperledger is a part of, but also in blockchain technology. And today we have with us some real firepower, some really heavy talent when it comes to talking about not just conceptually what can be done with blockchain technology, but also what's being done on the ground with these tools. Hyperledger, as you know, is an open source project hosted, again, by the Linux Foundation. We've been in existence for about 4 years. We actually technically got started. In fact, Jerry Cuomo here launched the project with the Linux Foundation in December of 2015, and the first code drop happened in February of 2016, and I joined about June of that year. And in the last 4 years, we've really gone from being this aspirational, kind of conceptual, kind of let's see if this works kind of thing, to something that is now implemented in production and running some major systems in the world, everywhere from supply chain traceability in food and diamonds and just about everything you can think of, to major trade finance networks around the world, to digital identity systems that are being deployed everywhere. And we were just talking before the beginning. You know, I joked at the beginning of my tenure at Hyperledger that, you know, our job was to make blockchain boring by making it more widely implemented and pervasive everywhere. And I dare say we've succeeded in that. But certainly there's so much more to do. And certainly, you know, we're still at a moment when enterprise DLT technology is it's still taking off, improving itself, and there's still so much of the world to transform through its application. So we're really excited today to be talking about where we have seen some successes and where we think it could go. Let me give you a little bit of the run of show for today. We will start with 2 presentations, one from Jerry Cuomo, who, as I mentioned, was really a co-founder of the project back then, and has continued to be one of the biggest champions inside of IBM for the technology. He's an IBM fellow, and he's also CTO of IBM's hybrid cloud integration platform, now with Red Hat coming in and so much investment going into the cloud. He's really seeing how all that weaves together and how blockchain technology, how enterprise distributed ledger technology becomes a major part of that. He'll be followed by Heran Shah, who's executive of global sales for IBM blockchain platform, really helping manifest it and materialize it there on the ground with so many of IBM's partners. And then we'll have a panel discussion. I'll moderate, and we'll have Shyam Nagarajan, who's the Director of Go-to-Market for Blockchain Networks with IBM Services, Rajesh Dudu, VP and Practice Leader for Blockchain and Cybersecurity for Tech Mahindra, and then Murali Sapa, who's VP of Engineering at Chainyard. So lots of great talent here, and we will be, this is done webinar style. Feel free to add questions to the Q&A as time goes on. We also have chat open, although we can't guarantee we'll be following the chat, so please be forgiving on that. And with that, let's see, let me just check in with my co-hosts. I should mention, by the way, I'm joined here today by Julian Gordon, who is the VP for the Asia Pacific region for Hyperledger, based normally in Hong Kong, but he's today in the United Kingdom. Say hi, Julian, as well as thanks, as well as Dorothy Chang, who oversees our marketing for the region. Julian, anything else I should get out before we go further?
No, that's perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Well, with that, let me throw the mic over to Jerry, and I think there's perhaps a deck that goes up as well. Or maybe that's...
Yeah. Hey, Brian. Yeah. Thanks, Brian, and thank you all from our India region who are joining us. So can I just talk about, Brian just led into it. The hype is over. I had jet black hair before we started this blockchain mission in December of 2015, and now I run, the ticket desk for Hyperledger Fabric, and watching all you all using it and saying, oh, we need this to do this. So I know it's out there. I know it's being used. I know it's in production in many cases. So the hype is over, and that's kind of what this talk is, and a little bit about where we're going. So Heran, if you can go to the next slide. Heran's driving this presentation. So
sure.
let's go into the agenda now with the first slide. Maybe skip the next one. So as I was saying, go ahead, Heran.
Can you see the agenda?
Yeah. Let's go forward. Okay. We'll see the agenda in real life. All right. So I just said this, and here's some data from Deloitte. They asked their followers to describe, the best view of the relevance of blockchain in their organization coming in the coming 24 months. And we see that we're still making progress there. Top 5 strategic priorities, and that's growing. And the other ones show at best the same level of interest, and in many cases, blockchain continues to increase. And when you get right down to it, this is, you think about things like, in IBM, artificial intelligence and what we started with, Deep Blue back in the Kasparov chess contest, was that the 70s, late 70s, early 80s? And then the infamous Jeopardy, in the, early 2000s, late 90s, I don't know exactly when that was, but look at the time from hype to now the reality of AI. And I think you'll all agree, based on our 5-year track record at Hyperledger, we're tracking ahead of that hype curve, right? So you're going to see examples, right? And because when you come right down to it, the use cases are pretty straightforward and quite relevant, as we're going to see in the next slide. Data validation, data access sharing, identity protection. These are basic functions of enterprise, but blockchain provides a transformative way to address these things. And we're going to see those examples as we go. So it's not just a nicer mousetrap, it's fundamental. Bringing a group together, bringing communities together to work to solve a problem, whether that problem is data validation, data sharing, identity protection, and we'll see that in the examples. Well, let's keep going here. Next slide. But wait, something happened on the way to the show. Right now, if I was giving this talk in February, it would be a very different talk. And this world pandemic, we're experiencing this together. It's impacting industries generously across. Some are experiencing significant headwinds. Some are kind of getting a boost and a lift, but there is a couple things, whether you have tailwinds propelling you, like healthcare. Think about in a hospital, the need to bring on more health professionals and rapidly bring them in to your organization, vet them, make sure their data and credentials are accurate. So even though you have these tailwinds, this environment is forcing change where speed and data accuracy is paramount. And then for those who are experiencing headwinds, like the travel and tourism industry, we will get a vaccine. I want to make sure the person I'm sitting next to on the plane has been vaccinated without giving me too much information about their private life. So I want to, somehow anonymize that information, but have some certainty when I go through the TSA in New York City to get to an international flight that, on the whole, it's safe. And I think that will propel things. And go on, the hygiene products, ventilators, take a hygiene product. How do we know the authenticity, the provenance, that it actually was produced by who it claims to be produced by, and it contains what it claims to actually contain? How do we prove that, right? So I think this is the challenge, but also the opportunity for blockchain. So I see COVID is what it is. We are adapting as a worldwide community, and I see blockchain as something that will hasten the relief of Corona. So let's go on with a couple of real examples here. So I talked, we in the U.S., Ford Motor Company started producing ventilators, and I hear companies, famous clothes manufacturers are producing designer masks. But how do we get them into the supply chain? I don't know of any hospital that has Ford on their approved vendor list. I don't know about the companies you work for. I would say IBM is a standard big company. A new supplier takes 45 days on average to become a supplier to the IBM company. I talk to others. That doesn't seem unreasonable. And during this process, there's regulations about bringing on suppliers, vetting them, making sure they have the credentials and all of this kind of stuff. So 45 days is not unreasonable. Well, unless speed and, what we just talked about with the current conditions of Corona, we need to onboard new medical suppliers, et cetera. So the Trust Your Supplier network, our friend Morali is from Chainyard. It was done in partnership with Chainyard before this happened, but it's just in time because we were able to pivot this network to be more applicable to medical suppliers and hospital buyers, and create flexibility in the supply chain with speed. So that the idea is, like, if you already signed on to a major hospital as a supplier, and there are other hospitals that are part of that network, the Trust Your Supplier network, instead of taking 45 days, maybe it takes 5 days. And that 5 days could make all the difference if you're trying to, bring in new ventilators into your company. So again, a big deal, blockchain just in time, not hype, real. And, with a little pivoting, just in time pivoting, the Trust Your Supplier network is right there when the world needs it. Let's keep going to the next slide. Data, trust in data. And I think this has multiple dimensions. This is the Mipasa information hub focused around coronavirus data. So it's a data hub where there is third-party validation for data sources, like coronavirus information from different regions around the world, the World Health Organization, et cetera. So it's a hub of validated data sources where developers could come and mash up and create new views on existing data with speed, because the sources of those data, that data is trusted. And it's not that it's, maliciously untrustworthy, but it's just, in the race for speed, sometimes things get sloppy, out of order, misplaced, et cetera. So having that provenance of where the data came from, who it came from, in an immutable, auditable way, gives you peace of mind to move at speed. And that's what we're seeing. I said there was two sides to this story. So this is running today. It's actually powered by Hyperledger Fabric and is running, parts of it are running on the IBM blockchain network. However, other members of the community who were also in and around Hyperledger got involved. So Oracle is a competitor of IBM, but for this case, they said, hey, we have a commercial offering that is a commercial distribution of Hyperledger Fabric. We want to join in. So perhaps in one of the first world scale level interoperability use cases, we have the Mipasa network as a distributed network between IBM Cloud and Oracle Cloud. And we also now have Microsoft talking about participating as well, right? So it proves also the importance of open source de facto standards and interoperability, right? And I think, again, just in time It's not hype. It's really out there doing the job. Next slide. All right, so with that said, that's where we are today, where we're going. And I just want to touch on this data from Gartner, because it does track some of the things that we are seeing, that we've been in a blockchain inspired world where POCs rule, and now we're really into the blockchain complete stage where we're going past the POC and we're actually going into production. And then the third phase, and I'm going to talk about that on this next slide, is what I like to call blockchain inside. We don't talk a lot about AI. We talk about Alexa and what it delivers. And there's AI inside, but it's powering an outcome, right? And I see this now really building up. Next slide. Because you see, folks, blockchain we're seeing does one thing that, again, is just in time, and that is bringing algorithmic trust and acting as a nexus of new technologies, which are critical in today's world where self-service, automation is digital services are paramount. So algorithmic trust versus reputational trust. And let me pick on AI, because it's something actually I am focusing on. If you go to my LinkedIn, you can read an article about the relationship between blockchain, AI, and IoT. And quite frankly, as I really look into AI and the creation of models and fueling those models with training data, I scratch my head and say, how can the consumer world actually consume this? In food, the FDA, in the US came along, like many other regions around the world, and said, you got to put food labels to say where this food came from, and that it does indeed contain sugar or nuts that may be potentially harmful to your health. But there's no such thing on an AI-based or IoT product. It's like, yeah, this was trained. It could have been trained by the pharmacy that's trying to sell you those drugs, that doctor advisor, right? So how do we gain trust? Algorithmic trust, not reputational trust. The folks at IBM were all Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, so they're trustworthy, loyal, helpful, No. It's that plus proofs, right? And I think when you look at the future of blockchain inside, right? This example of, we have at least 2 or 3 customers. I believe one is in production with this car sharing app, right? And when you look at what it brings together across AI and IoT, how blockchain is fueling that trust, right? To allow these applications to run at speed, detecting where the cars are available, mapping out where chargers are, being able to set up smart contracts for making sure you have your insurance, your payments, and everything aligned, right? And doing this all in a hands-free, corona-friendly way, right? So again, this is where the future is trending. Blockchain at the nexus of these new technologies, not necessarily as a thing unto itself, but really as that algorithmic trust factor that we need to allow the digital world to occur at speed. All right, let's keep going. All right, another thing, a future thing, is tokens. And people come to me all the time and want to get into the details of frameworks and interoperability between frameworks. All major frameworks support the creation of digital assets. That's what they do. What they don't do necessarily is allow an easy way to unlock the value in networks, right? And I think the rise of tokens and some of the token standards that are starting to appear and the frameworks that are starting to implement these standards is a critical future thing, because it's going to unlock the value in these disparate networks to allow a web of these enterprise networks to come together so that value can be trustfully exchanged, right? So I think, this is a piece that we continue to look at and foster forward as a cross interoperability play. I think interoperability of frameworks is a longer road to toe. Interoperability of assets and exchange of assets is much more achievable and actually valuable when you look at the supply chains and questions and the networks that are available. So let's keep going. And I just want to keep my eye on the time too. So
you're doing good.
Okay. So this brings us, I'm kind of reverse engineering this. So what's underneath all of this, right? The rise of enterprise blockchain is changing everyday life for the better. So how did we get here in IBM? And I think it's a fun and interesting journey. I put my kids through school because of transaction processing, technologies related to, and IBM has maintained leadership in the years. It's something we focus on. It's something that matters to our customers, transaction processing with speed and integrity. So I got my antenna up, and then, some time ago, out to lunch, a few of my colleagues were Bitcoin mining. And, after just talking about, getting past the get rich quick side of it, I started really getting to understand what this thing called blockchain was, maybe in 2014, circa. And then relating it back to transaction processing. And I said, okay, from a new type of currency, it's interesting. But if there are 1,000 applications for this, Bitcoin was one, cryptocurrency was one. What about the other 999? So what about the other applications? And then the violin started playing when I saw Ethereum, and specifically this notion of smart contracts. So I really fell in love with that notion because for me, that was the answer. Smart contracts were the answer to bridging this technology out to multiple industries and multiple use cases. But we needed something that we can stand behind. And I was having a conversation with someone telling me that their public network technology doesn't fork, meaning the ledgers cannot become inconsistent. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, we have all of these computer scientists that have done proofs that this technology will not fork. And we'll show you the proofs, we'll take you through it. I said, I don't want to see the proofs. I want to talk to the people that wrote the code. Because last I checked, they're probably human, and humans make errors. And then what are you going to do? Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters when a problem occurs. And then when that problem occurs, your decentralized network becomes the most centralized piece because someone has to come in. How do you upgrade that network? Oh, no, so somehow there's magic in computer science over the software doesn't have to be upgraded. So these practical performance, upgradability, maintainability, it's a thing. It's a thing. And it's why people look at companies like IBM to stand behind software. So we had to get behind a piece of software that we can trust its provenance, no pun intended. So, Brian, told the story. We donated some code, which became the found. It's not that I had this complete love affair or religious bias to Hyperledger Fabric. It's Ghostbusters. It's who are you going to call? Like when you have to actually remediate and do something about something, because stuff is going to happen. Believe me, I've seen it all in the 5 years of stuff happening. You need to go in there, humble yourself and fix it. And you have to have the ability and the skills to go do it, right? So our investment as a community in Hyperledger Fabric, you can't be great at 5 things, right? You could be great at 1 or 2 things. So this is one of our bets. The result, and this number fluctuates, but we've been averaging over 1,000 networks. The majority of those networks are experimental. We see a consistent 10%, that number is probably going up, that are becoming production. So, in the 100 now, probably even getting close to 200 in that really active consortias. And again, several of these are changing everyday life. I will pick up my pace because Heran is going to tell you, he's going to pinpoint and pick out some of these in the 10% and tell you a little bit more. So I want to make sure we get to that. So let's go to the next slide, Heran. So, Hyperledger Fabric is software. It's good software. It's part of a greenhouse of growing good software at the Linux Foundation's Hyperledger project. We, like several other vendors, have a commercial distribution. of that open source project. It is authentic to that open source. We pick the GitHub build. We run a battery of tests through it. We deem a particular version, a build of Hyperledger Fabric, the build, because it passed all the tests. We containerize it. We sign the container as, we just gone through all of this stuff, and this one really authentically does this, and it becomes the foundation of what we call the IBM blockchain platform. We enhance it with some advanced tooling. We enhance it with some open source deployment technologies and kind of marrying Fabric to Kubernetes so that it can run just about anywhere. And that's kind of the essence of the IBM blockchain platform. It runs on the IBM cloud. It runs on AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and on your own premises. And combinations thereof, because after all, this is a network technology. And we actually just proved that this will also work with Oracle's commercial distribution of Hyperledger Fabric. And I'm sure AWS's version will work as well. The tooling technology, while it is unique to the IBM blockchain platform, the team is under an agreement that the tooling produces 100% Hyperledger Fabric compatible artifacts, which means if you want to pick up your network and move it someplace else, you have all the right to do that. You're not locked in by IBM. So that's kind of the flexibility of this open architecture that we know of as IBM blockchain platform. Next slide. We'd love you to try it out because you're going to see a bunch of examples coming up from Heran. We talked earlier, Brian, when he introduced me, talked about my expanded role around hybrid cloud, working with, among others, the Red Hat team. Red Hat has this quite interesting marketplace of predominantly open software, where we now have the IBM blockchain platform sitting. You can actually try it for free. It actually deploys to containers of your choice. So you can actually try it. But more importantly, not only can you try the code, we also have put some code patterns out there where you can actually get busy with different usage patterns, like we talked about earlier, the data verification, the data exchange, shared data, et cetera. So it's out there, it's free. That's where, all of the customers that Heran is about to talk about start. So thank you for your time. This is Beyond Hype. It's just in time, given the world we're living in right now. And, I thank, all of the community involved, because we're really seeing in these times the importance of open source, the importance of community-led. And over to you, Heran.
Thank you, Jerry. And, in one of your slides, you mentioned the A word related to Amazon. Hundreds of those devices are, asking, how can I help you? Right? So people who are going to watch this on YouTube, a word that Jerry uses is going to start the device. So be careful.
Oh, but yeah. Every time you say that word.
The A word, which I will not say because I have two of them. They'll just, they just turned on. But thank you, Jerry. And folks, thank you so much. Kamlesh, Julian, Brian, thank you for having Jerry, Sham, and others. And there is a reason why we decided to do this meetup. Our first one was in Australia, beginning of the year, in person. Those were the good days. But one of the things we have seen is there is a VS Code extension for Hyperledger Fabric that we have developed and given out there for the community to use. And we see the amount of downloads. We don't know who they are, but we know where they are. It used to be US #1, India #2. That has turned in last few months. Majority of the downloads are in India. And we looked at that and said, hey, we are not talking, with the people in India. We are talking through somebody, but not directly. So that was the whole premise for this.
So So it's on recording now. Recording now. Yes.
Mhm. All right. Thank you very much, Dorothy and Kamlesh. So as Jerry mentioned, the whole journey of blockchain or Hyperledger Fabric, especially. And, the journey has been phenomenal over the last 5 years. We see a lot of use cases in production, a very big pipeline on pilot. But over the last 3-4 years, what we have seen is a pattern of use cases, which is in this slide. So what we see is, and Deloitte kind of confirmed in their own way, the same thing in the very first slide that Jerry walked us through. So it doesn't matter, any industry, we have seen these 4 patterns. And then at the end, I'll talk about cross-industry as well. So identity is number 1 use case. Know your customer, know your supplier. You saw the trust your supplier slide that Jerry mentioned, and know your device. Second one is fraud, right? Now, fraud, there are multiple examples. It can be your university degree or diploma, to any learning credential, to a commercial piece of paper, or an invoice or a purchase order against which lending is done, right? So we have seen fraud in that, and I'll walk you through some of the examples where we see implementation in an industry. The third one is dispute management. If you look at a buyer and a seller, and especially a bank in the middle, right? When you look at it from what is happening in COVID, one of the biggest challenge we have seen is in the supply chain is literally on tethers. It is broken. I have personal experience, outside of Amazon, where I bought something on an e-commerce site of a supplier, and it takes months and months to get them to ship something, and if you receive it, and if there is a damage, to ship it back. The part that is working is the moment you order something and they ship it, you get charged. So the payment side is working, right? The banking side is working, but the rest is broken. And how does that impact the rest of the transactions and commerce as a whole? And the last one is provenance. Provenance, which means end-to-end insight into data, information, and goods, right? So if you can get near real-time insight, in US, you saw a lot of protest during the summer months. And one of the biggest challenge was people lost trust in their government institutions. A video recorded by the police was found to be fabricated. But the worst part was anything that was published after that by citizens, there was no provenance. It was basically, people just wanted to believe what they saw, right? So these are the 4 places we have seen a lot of use of blockchain. The differentiator is this, trust. So blockchain provides that inherent trust between in a multi-party transaction, whether it is data sharing, whether it is information sharing, whether it is video sharing, whether it is identity, because you can for sure know that anything that is entered in blockchain, regardless of which DLT you use, technology you use, that there is trust. And when you are in a multi-party transaction, that is key. Also, what we have seen is, move away from technology into governance, right? Now that I'm sharing data, I want to make sure that the governance, people looking at this data have a governance model around it. This has nothing to do with technology. Technology is just an enabler. This is the business side of conversation. So what we have seen is 3 different ways a blockchain network gets started. And this is purely based on use case. And that has been our observation. So very first one is a consortia. People on a use case where multi-party transaction or commerce is happening, use consortia when these participants are part of a transaction or are competing against each other. So for example, if you take an invoice that is factored or discounted, lending against invoice, right? In that case, there are multiple banks involved in making sure there is no fraud. So let me walk you through that. What happens is, the first bank gives money against this invoice. They have a risk if the same invoice is discounted by another bank. The second bank has also the risk because if this seller is in default or something goes wrong, both the banks suffer. So they want to make, the first one wants to make sure that every bank knows they are discounting an invoice. Second, third, fourth bank in that whole chain wants to make sure they are not discounting an invoice that has already been discounted, right? So that is where coming together, you do not have to have a legal entity. You just need governance. Governance, in other words, is rules of engagement. That's all it is. It is nothing fancy, nothing more than that. The second one we have seen is founder-led. So anybody who has a very big interest in the supply chain or data sharing or any of the use cases I mentioned, they can start a network. So when this was literally 4 years ago, when we started a network for food trust, it was with Walmart. And we started that as a pilot in China. And it was all about making sure that all the people, all the producers, and everybody in between, the starting point of farm, all the way to consumer, was on this blockchain. And Walmart wanted to make sure that when they recall something, they know exactly which farm it came from, and wanted to reduce the whole idea that you have to throw away everything because there is a salmonella scare. So instead of throwing good with the bad, they can identify the farm where that spinach came from and make sure that all the precautions are taken, including recall, only for that farm and not everybody else. So there is a very good, argument to be made, not to have a consortia, but a founder-led blockchain network. And the third one we have seen a lot is intermediary-led. So the whole premise of blockchain is to remove the intermediaries. But then intermediaries have very good infrastructure in place, right? And I don't mean technology infrastructure, the whole, business, technology, application, etc. They are the best to get in front of blockchain, bring all these participants together, build the governance model, but they are just a conveyor. They do not do anything beyond that. The participants who are in that commerce are the ones that lead that. So again, every use case defines the go-to network model. It is not one or the other. It is all around governance. It is all around rules of engagement. And that is business, not technology. So let me walk through some use cases. CIP or CP, as they call it in Brazil, they are an intermediary. My very last point on governance. They are an intermediary that was set up by all the banks to remove fraud when in the check processing business. This fraud, has been there from day one, right? It used to be on checks, paper checks. The term rubber check is exactly what it was. And if you have seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, this was the example, right? So there is a fraud where people print a check, take it to the bank, cash it, right? So CIP and quite a lot of others like this in every country has been set up to make sure that before processing a check, it is validated. Now in today's world, bill payment is done by digital format. My phone is how I do all my bill payments and digital payments, basically. So what happened to the check processing? That went down. But the fraud is still there. Only thing is it moved from a physical piece of paper to a digital asset. So CIP has set up a, they've taken that same infrastructure, went into the digital side of it, and set up this, device ID, or know your device. So before a transaction is made, there are 3 different ways that challenge that digital device to validate that before they allow for the transaction. Second one is fraud. We just set this up, Lygon, in Australia, and it went live. But this is one of the many examples of letter of guarantee. There is BCI in Thailand with banks and power companies. Lygon is banks and real estate companies. There's one in South Africa, and there are quite a few if you do a search on letters of guarantee and blockchain. So in case of Lygon, what happened was anybody who wants to rent or lease a commercial property has to provide guarantee from the bank that they will make their payments. There is a possibility to print that letter of guarantee and take it to the commercial real estate folks, give it to them, and you get your keys. Until you stop paying, nobody knows that this was really issued by a bank or was it a fraudulent letter of guarantee. So what has happened is Lygon, which is a consortium of all the banks, and the real estate company came together, built this blockchain use case. Right? And now what happens is the person who is leasing that property is nowhere in the middle. Letter of guarantee is issued by the bank on the blockchain network and received by the commercial real estate folks. And at that point, the fraud is removed. Same thing happens with BCI in Thailand. If you want to get power, whether it is rural or in Bangkok, right, metropolitans, you use the same mechanism to issue letter of guarantee. So fraud is what I mentioned under the use case, but it grows across many industries. We have seen Marsh issue proof of insurance, in other words, letter of guarantee, proof of insurance for people who are engaged in any activity, right? We have seen that across the board, right? Whether it is a university giving away diplomas, or banks, or insurance, you name it. It can be public sector as well, right? So when you get no objection certificate before you move into your house, right? That comes from your local authority. And again, the same thing, right? It comes directly from them to the folks who give you the keys. The next one is dispute management. And I picked up Tenant for a very good reason. So Tenant is a power company in Germany, and they built their entire blockchain on Hyperledger Fabric. And what we see beyond Tenant, right? 2 different things. So one is certifying that the source of energy in a building is green. And there is a big debate about this, right? So, most people are coming out. Amazon just said by 2040, all their trucks will be green. In other words, not use fossil fuel. JP Morgan Chase has said the same thing. Their buildings will be green. How do we prove, right? So that whole provenance of energy generated through solar panels or whatnot is monitored, right, across the entire food chain, from source all the way to consumption, is one place. And when that happens, you get a certificate. Some call it IREX, some call it green bonds, and that goes into trading. What Tenant has done is used this the blockchain technology to help them manage the power supply between green power and fossil fuel. One of the biggest challenge in Europe and everywhere else is the dual requirement. One requirement is there cannot be any blackouts or brownouts. So electric companies have to produce power no matter what. The other side is they have to reduce their carbon footprint. So what happens? Whenever there is very high demand for power, they have to turn on fossil fuels. Fossil, right? Coal or something. When they do that, they increase their carbon footprint. So now they have to buy carbon credits. Tesla makes every quarter in $700, $800, $900 million, right? Just by selling those carbon credits. So this whole carbon trading is something that we look at very, very closely in terms of dispute management. But we have done the same thing with very large buyers and sellers. IBM does global financing. At any given time, we have $100 million in dispute, right, between buyers and sellers. So we put this entire problem on blockchain. And what we found out was the number one reason was, seller has sent it, buyer has not received it. And the dispute goes on and on for days. And the only way it can be resolved is phone calls, faxes, emails, etc. We put that on blockchain and we make API calls on the tracking number. And we resolve disputes in days and hours, not in months. Now, these invoices have a high propensity to get paid on time. So take it a step further, these banks can take these invoices that they have lent against and securitize them, and with a very reduced risk. So we see this whole dispute management in a very different light. Going to the next one, Cineverse. This is a very different example from the one I explained in the previous slide. So if you look at this, right, Cineverse is a company that does a lot of work behind the scene, but nobody knows about them. So when you travel anywhere, especially international, there are roaming charges on your mobile phone, whether it is data or phone calls or whatever, right? That whole process is managed by Cineverse. So Cineverse is that intermediary that is doing all the reconciliations and settlement and managing disputes with all the roaming charges, and end of the day, one person pays to the other, right? So to manage this entire process with trust built into it, they've put this on blockchain network, right, on Hyperledger Fabric. And they do this netting. The same thing CLS is doing for FX. The same thing Visa is doing for B2B payments, right? And these are all on Hyperledger Fabric. So we see netting as another use case. We have seen an intermediary in Latin America do netting against ATM machines. So the law says that ATM machines have to have money all the time, even during bank holidays, right? Especially it hits hard when there is a 3-day bank holiday, right? So banks can either borrow money from central bank and pay interest or lend to each other. But that lending has a whole reconciliation process and a netting process between all these banks. So we've seen intermediaries start this kind of networks on blockchain. They've taken their existing process, put that on blockchain, and become the conveyor of the network rather than the monopolistic entity that they were. We trade, there is a lot of press on it, but I'll put it as this: it's invoice reconciliation. And it is kind of in two places. Sorry, invoice factoring. It is dispute management, as I explained, and fraud, both at the same time. So WeTrade is a consortium of 7 banks, and I can tell you how it started. I was at the Delhi airport, 2 in the morning, flying in from US, and in a little lounge, we worked on this opportunity. And at that time, WeTrade had no idea what they were getting into. So their criteria was, let us see if blockchain is the right technology. Let us see how we can build governance. Let us see how we can monetize. And if these 3 things work, fine. Otherwise, we'll just pick up marbles and leave. 7 banks started this, right, in Europe. And they started with small and medium businesses, not the large customers, because small and medium businesses are underserved by banks due to very, very high cost. So the 4th criteria that they met was cost sharing. Can we work with our competitors, share cost without giving away competitive advantage? So WeTrade was set up. By end of this year, it will grow to 15, and by end of next year to 50. So it is all about invoice discounting, as I mentioned in the past, making sure invoices are dispute-free, and they're only lent once today. But in the future, they can have multiple lenders lend on a single invoice and reduce their risk, right? So we see, we see this as one of the use cases that works around consortiums. So you saw Cineverse, CLS, Visa as intermediary led. This is the one that works around consortiums. Venturas is a very good use case where what we have seen, again, provenance, right, and insight. Provenance and insight. So as I explained the Walmart example, this is the same thing for fleet and fleet owners. We are looking at, and there is an example that, that I'll talk about. In provenance, we see blockchain providing a certain part of that transaction. The other side of that is IoT, and the third one is AI. So think about it, in the new world where, if you are driving from one place to another, and if your car is IoT enabled, it can identify, how much fuel is there in the tank, and when do you need that refueling or recharging of batteries, find you the nearest charging station, get you, or petrol station, get you to fill up your tank, charge you for that. And while you are over there, if the charging takes, 45 minutes to an hour, get Uber Eats to bring you your food, right? So Venturas is beginning the first part, which is removing disputes, but providing insight from end to end on fuel supplies to the fleet. So the entire journey, and this is used very heavily in industrial sector, in distribution sector. There are multiple trucks managed by a single distributor like Amazon, Walmart, Target, etc. Right? And there is a big reconciliation based on how much fuel was purchased, where, and when. Right? So Venturas has provided this platform that they are now reselling to fleet users, right? And then there are adjacency of use cases around it, like I mentioned, about AI and IoT. Let me now jump into the next phase where we see cross-industry use cases. These are not there yet, but we see pockets, we see silos, right? So if you look at this B2C, right, cross-industry, the first child was registered on Hyperledger Fabric, in Rio de Janeiro, and his name is Alejandro Alvarez. This happened a couple of years ago. And that starts building the genesis of a blockchain network for identity, right? So now Alejandro is on that blockchain. When he reaches an age where he starts schooling, at that time, all the benefits around that are validated against his birth date, right? And nobody can change that. It is tamper-proof. Voting rights, driver's license, social security, all the way, to the end of life, right? The whole life chain. This same information is fed to other users. For example, banks, when they do know your customer, KYC, or when Alejandro goes to a telephone company to get a mobile phone, validation of his identity, right? And the source is the government entity that issued him birth certificate, right? So now you have proper insight across the whole chain, his whole lifespan, right? And it creates so many other facilities where you can remove disputes. So for example, benefits, right? Today we are global workers. We pay benefits in multiple places. Europe has a big problem. Somebody in Europe can go across any country, work and pay social security, which is reconciled when they retire. And most of the time they retire at in the country where they were born. So all these different 23 countries, 26 countries have to bring all that information together and then provide benefit from the country where you retire. Massive reconciliation issue, right? And we have built a network just for that. The second one is B2B. Using the same example, when a corporation is registered, it is registered at a county or a district or state level, and that registration is birth certificate for that company. That information can be provided to the bank for trust your supplier, to any buyer of that supply, whatever they manufacture or services they provide. It can be given to these folks for onboarding, this particular customer, right? Because the information comes from this public sector registry, right? And then it opens up everything to them. Just the way I talked about B2C, it's the same thing with B2B. Now that you're onboarded, letter of guarantees can be issued very easily because they know who you are, right? And every entity, people selling the service, people consuming the service. The whole financing can work around it because you can trust that supplier and suppliers, right? You can do track and trace. You can do everything around it. Is this here? Absolutely not. But the circles and many more like this, we see them as silos. So what we see is two things happening. One is global footprint of a network, especially where supply chain is concerned, because there is less regulation. In finance or in banking, insurance, we don't see that. It will be more regional. The use cases will be replicated, but the network itself will be regional. Same thing with public sector. But even at a regional level, all these silos will start to come together and share information. Very first slide we saw, right? Sharing of information. So within Europe, European countries are sharing information. With a proper governance model, the whole life chain can be established across Europe, across US, and a lot of other countries like that. So what have we done? At IBM, when we started blockchain, our intent was not technology, but networks. Networks that fuel commerce regionally and globally. And here is a small subset. But the best part of this is, if you look at, this is marine, marine network that we have set up with Merck's. The customers on this ship goods across border. So what does that mean? The same customers have adjacency of use cases, right? In terms of dispute management, in terms of, from docks to the manufacturer, a full insight on other means of transportation, right? Same thing applies here. So all these are adjacency of use cases where it started with one, but now that you have everybody in that network or most of it, you can launch the second use case. So we are now doing two things. One is continuing to scale these networks and replicate these networks, at the same time applying adjacency of use case, because the rules of governance are already there, right? How you will engage and do commerce. The infrastructure is already in place. Technology is very, very mature and proven. It's just a matter of adding another use case. So we trade, which factors invoices, can also start lending against purchase orders, against goods, etc. Right? So that is where we are headed. So in 2020, there is a small bump with COVID, but that gave us extra time to focus on supply chain. We see tremendous growth on supply chain. And at the same token, scaling these networks that are already in place. And so, lastly, what is happening on Friday, 25th, right? And the whole series, we have two intent. Hype is over. Blockchain, Hyperledger Fabric, DLT, that hype is over. This is real. People are, building networks, 3 different ways I mentioned. We selected India beginning of this year for a very specific reason, or ISA, Southeast Asia. We have a VS Code extension, which you can use with Hyperledger Fabric to build your smart contracts. And that is free, anybody can download. When we looked at the number of downloads, until last year, it was US #1, followed by India. That turned in January. India is now number one. Through this this whole series of and next 3 weeks, we will see more networks coming out of Southeast Asia. But we have seen the reason for number one download of this VS Code extension is because multinationals are in India. The global integrators like Tata, Accenture, Cognizant, and others are also in India, and they are building networks and blockchain use cases for a lot of people around the world. So I am sure there are a lot of hidden networks in India and Southeast Asia. We want to put this spotlight on Southeast Asia through this four-part series. So hopefully through Jerry's presentation, my presentation, you have seen what are these use cases, what is real, what is not a hype, and the next phase, which is governance. So I will stop here. Thank you all, and please make sure you listen to rest of the presentations coming starting 25th on Friday and every Friday for 3 weeks. Thank you, Kamlesh, and thank you to the Hyperledger Fabric organization, Linux Foundation, for giving Jerry and I a chance to present what we have been very actively participating in, and we see revolution happening through blockchain. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Heran. Yeah, thank you, Heran. So I think it's really good presentation. The customers which are present, not kind of market, mid know about Walmart, not such kind of CIP, is kind of new. Thank you, Heran. Thank you, Heran.
Yep. Yeah, that is the whole thing, right? There was 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of technology-driven conversation, which we saw change in mid-2018, early 2019 to use cases. And then towards end of 2019, we started seeing something else. The whole technology use case discussion changed into governance, right? Rules of engagement. And that is where we see a lot of emphasis. So people have passed, Jerry calls this 3-phase, BLT, right? Business, legal, technology. Technology got resolved. If you're doing transactions, go with Hyperledger Fabric, period. If you're doing, so use cases, which is the business side of it, right? So technology, done. Business, now you have use cases that will help fuel blockchain networks. And third piece is legal in the sense governance. How do we work with multiple parties in a transaction, in a blockchain network, making sure when data is shared or data is appended, that there is proper accountability, proper audit. And last but not the least, the link over here, in an effort to make developers move their use cases fast, we have built a lot of smart contracts, ready to deploy smart contracts, which pretty much will reduce 80% of your work, right? So it is a front end with logic and the whole smart contract for Hyperledger Fabric. Go there, download. Most of the use cases I mentioned are there. And then this is all on GitHub, so it's free, knock yourself out. We're also going to start encouraging folks to contribute here. The way you contribute to Hyperledger Fabric, same way, start contributing use cases and smart contracts so others can use it anywhere in the world, right? It's all community driven. So Kamlesh, I'll end here.
Yeah, thank you, Heran. Yeah, thank you, Heran.
Or you stop recording.
Thank you.